Hey everybody, welcome back. DJ here. This is going to be a video on rendering jewelry using Octane Render. We're going to be going over the project settings, lighting, materials, and compositing. So by the time you're done, you should be able to get very similar results to these right here. So before we begin, I kind of want to show you where you can get this file. So if you go onto the Gumroad, DJ Tutorials Gumroad, there's going to be a link in the video description down below. There's going to be a link to this file, and basically you're going to get a file where you can render this out to look just like this, and it has a couple of images on what the user interface looks like within Blender and gives some description and stuff like that. So it's currently set for $1. You can put whatever you want, as long as it's $1 or more, to donate to the channel for this project file. So let's go ahead and look at the project file. So here it is, and I'll just zoom out, and you can see I have this really big backdrop here. And we have some lights, we have some objects, and all that. So I'm going to sort of like do a little bit of a different way than I normally do these tutorials. I'm just going to kind of show you what the node setups look like, because most people who are using Octane kind of have a general idea about how to do CGI and some shading and stuff like that, or at least I hope so, because it's a more advanced engine. And you're probably looking for some more specific material node setups and stuff like that. So first, and I know this is going to be difficult, let's start off by just talking about the user interface with coloring. So how I have the project set up is if I go over to the render properties over here, and if we look at the color management, you can see that I have the display device set as sRGB, which is for a screen, so the monitor I'm using. And the view transform, a lot of you guys like to use Filmic. I'm using standard because that allows me a little bit more color freedom when I'm doing the compositing. And I set the sequencer down here to sRGB as well. So the next thing that you're going to want to do is, and I cover this in my tutorial that's on the basics with the engine, but let's just take a look at this anyway. The way that Octane Render works is that when we go to the rendered view, you have this view out of your camera. Let's just turn off the overlays here. You have this view out of your camera. You have another view that's just kind of in your viewer space here. And then you have your render, where when you render out your image, you're going to have a different color. So in order to get all of those set up the way that Blender users are used to, what I have done is I have set it up like this. So if I hit N, we can go over to where it says Octane. And you can click this right here that says Enable HDR Tone Mapping in Interactive Mode. So what you want to do is turn this on, and then turn on Override. And what that's going to do is it's going to override some of your color sets and everything like that with the sets that are going to be in here. So then what I did was the default has some vignetting. I just turned that down to 0. And then I made sure that this was set to response type, linear off. And this just keep it as the default response gamma LUT. And then you'll want to turn on the denoiser. Okay. So then what you'll want to do is, let's just minimize that and hit N. Then what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to go over here and turn on where it says denoiser, turn on beauty. Okay, and that's going to give you a nice little denoiser when you're done rendering. So that is how I was able to set it up to get the render and the viewer and the camera view all to look the same no matter what happens upon your output. So that is all in that project file, or you could just set it up in whatever project you're using right now. So let's go ahead and now just take a look at some materials. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to select a couple of the items here. And we're going to isolate just these here like this. And one thing that you'll really want to make sure that you're doing is, let's actually, looks like we need to turn on this background here. So let's just leave that on, but let's just zoom in a little bit. What you're going to do, and I cover this in a lot of my jewelry tutorial videos, but if we take the diamonds here and I hide those, you can see that there's little sockets. Now these aren't clean or anything. I just use a simple Boolean in the creation of this because I was being lazy. Technically you'd want to do like the channel set ring design that I did where you actually make some holes, but this worked just fine anyway, so it really didn't matter. But you'll want to make sure that your diamonds aren't being intersected by your base mesh that it's set on. So that's a key thing there. The other thing is that you will want to make sure that when you're setting your metals or your hard surfaces like this stuff here, you want to make sure that you have some nice bevels. Okay. So this is all kind of like modeling and, a little bit of the shading, and you can add some modifiers to add a bevel. But you'll want to make sure that even if it is a hard edge, that there's nothing that's super, super hard. You don't want a 90-degree angle change or something like that, because if you do, it will kind of show up and it will look a little bit weird, because even when you have a really sharp corner, it's never 100% at a 90-degree angle. The other thing is that your diamonds here need to be all flat. So you'll want to make sure that you right click, shade flat, and make sure that it stays that way, because you'll want these to be really, really harsh edges, unlike your metals and stuff like that. The diamonds, it actually works to your benefit to have these as very, very sharp changes, because that allows the dispersion effects to happen. Now, you can do this sort of stuff with whatever your uh, whatever your design is for your ring. It really doesn't matter as long as you sort of follow some of these principles. So that's why I'm kind of not like showing how to do like a modeling of this ring or anything like that. So let's take a look now at the way that some of this stuff is UV unwrapped, and it's not super detailed and it's not super difficult or anything. I just did some really basic stuff. So you can see here it was subdivided, but basically, whoa, looks like, there we go. So it looks like this here. And I just did some basic UV unwraps, I think I did just like some of these basic cylinder projections or something like that. And then on some other stuff, I marked some seams and all that. So I'm not going to go into how to do UV unwrapping, but you'll want to make sure that your objects are UV unwrapped. You can do procedural mapping, but I did not do procedural mapping for these items because I wanted it to be the same across multiple engines. So let's go ahead and take a look at one of the materials that a lot of people really want to know about, which is the diamonds. So let's just grab some of the items here. So we're going to grab these lights and some of the diamonds, isolate those, and let's just take a look at how we did the diamonds here. So if we take a look here at just these, you'll see that they look pretty brilliant. They look really awesome. And how we did this is basically there's a specular material here, this right here. If you just hit Shift A, you can add Octane Shader, specular material, which is right there. And you can just set some of these settings here. So there's all kinds of stuff you can do. IOR needs to be correct for the diamond material, so that would be this one here. You can look up these values. And for the dispersion coefficient, I honestly, I didn't like the way that when I found the numbers, is, quote unquote, supposed to be. I felt it was a little bit too much, so I knocked it down, and I thought this looked pretty good to me. But you're more than welcome to experiment with this and see what you think about, which coefficient looks the best. I kind of used an artistic approach because I felt it just needed that for this project. So if you remove this, you can see that it basically removes that dispersion and you get a really nice glass look. And it's super tiny if there's any. So I put a little tiny, 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 tiny bit on there. There is still just a little bit of dispersion, but it's not really obvious. Or if we mark this as a 0, which it still will go down to as low of a value as possible because we are using a specular material that has that dispersion in it. But you can see here that it does look a little bit more clean. There's not as much of that, rainbowy color to it. But I do think that a lot of people like to see that dispersion, so we just shove that right in there. And I just use this float value here and mark these all as the same just to give us this value. So let's take a look at another material. We're going to take a look at the metal material. So if I grab this and let's grab some of the, you know what, let's just look at this as it is like this here. Let's just look at it. So basically what we did, or what I did here for this material, is I provided some different colors. So these are a little bit more artistic than anything. I just sort of felt like these values looked a little bit better than the PBR values that I was finding online. But you'll want to start with this metal material. And where it gets a little confusing for a lot of people is if you just have the metal material, you can put all this stuff in here. And if you'll notice that when you start to add some colors, like this sheen right here, I'm just going to save this value. If I change this to like a red, you can see that the edges are changing color. You can see that right there. There's a reddish color there. If I change it to blue, it should turn blue. So this adds where there's that sheen color, it will change that. And it all has to do with this sheen roughness right here. Okay. So if I pull this around, you can see that it's adding or taking away some of that sheen to the edges here. It sort of uses like the Fresnel or layer weight values here to create that color. So you can change this to whatever you want, but I kept it kind of a off-white because a lot of metals do have a little bit of an off-white that's brighter than the original color here. And you can make a whole bunch of different colors if you'd like, but this felt right to me for a lot of these. But if you take this and you actually put this into the specular right here, and it's a little bit misleading because the specular, if we turn this to 0, you'll notice that it does change the material because specularity does, oops, you'll notice that it does change the specularity here because specular is an actual, you could put like a black and white value in here, but this is also the coloring of your metal, which is a little bit confusing because you'd have to kind of know that that's what you need to do. So once you plug that in, you can actually change the color to this, rose gold or coppery color, which I think looks really, really nice, or a white gold, which is a little bit off white. So it usually has a little bit of a yellowish color to it or an orangish color, or this gold value here, which will look more or less like that. So pretty cool. And you'll see here that it does take the coloring of the diamonds. It does kind of change the coloring a little bit since there is some of that color bleeding through. And that's why I put that different color in there. So if we look at this here, you can see I have a float value, which is set to a 1 for the scale. And I have these transforms. And basically what this is doing is it's putting a roughness and a normal map over the top of it. And both of these materials are provided by, one of them is from, I can't remember what it's called, but Texture Haven is called something else now. But if you do a search for Texture Haven, you can find something that's like this normal map that I'm using. And then I also have this gray, if we take a look at this, you actually have to reset the renderer to see it. There is a black and white color put in there, and then that's put in through a gradient texture, and then that is used in conjunction with this normal map to create some roughness and to create some bumpiness to the ring itself. So let's change this back to the white gold. And there we go. Now, one of the most important things about doing this is the lighting. And when you create lights inside of this program, they're done using actual geometry. So what you tend to have to do is this here, where a light, if we go to the light here, if you just go Shift A, add light and then an area light, or you could do 3-point lights, but you need to make sure, or my recommendation, use the lights like this. Don't use the spherical lights because those do end up being like geometry, and it kind of will increase your render times and stuff like that because there tend to be more bounces. But you can see here on the right, you have a diffuse material that if I take out the emission here, so it's just a plane, and then you have to add this emission texture over the top of it. And it depends on how it's set up as a texture. So you can see here it's 0.0001 for the texture. If I take out some of these zeros, you can see it gets really bright, right? So the texture has to do with how bright it is on your actual object, and then the power then multiplies whatever the value is of the texture. So this is a 0.003, remove this, and it will also make it a little bit brighter when you start to change the value there as well. So this is a way, it's not the only way to do lighting, but the lighting is really, really important. I also have an HDR that is sort of in the background there. You can see it. So there's an HDR light that's a studio setup with these right here. It would probably be the best to use a light box sort of look for the HDR background, but I like the dynamics that the darker areas give with this HDR. So that's why I use that. And how you set that up is if you go over to the world settings right here, you can change this to the environment here. So it says Octane environment, texture environment. Here's the image. And then there is a 32-bit float wrap around. And then I've changed the rotation here. And how that looks is if I go here to world in my node editor, you can see that here is the node setup for that. So not as straightforward and easy to do as other render engines, I know, but this is what you need to do. So we have the texture environment node. We have our image here that's set to power of 1, gamma to 1, and linear space just to leave it. I mean, you can turn this off and turn it on. It doesn't really do much. Spherical projection here, and then a rotation transform that I put here. Okay, so you have to do all this stuff in order for you to get this background set up in this particular way. All right, just so I can further just explain how the lighting kind of works here. If we go to the rendered view and I go into the lights here and I turn those off, you can see that this is just the regular HDR that's now lighting up the scene. Okay, and if I take that off, if I take that completely off, and let's go back into the lights, and I'll just turn on a couple here, you can see that basically what I've done is I have just added some extra sort of like oomph to certain sections. So you can see that there I have it set where it's sort of lighting up this side right here. I have this one that's lighting this side right here, and you can see that it really does bring out these really cool dispersion effects when you start adding these extra lights. So with both of them added, that's what you get there. So it's starting to look really nice. And then if we turn both of those off and just look at the one that's right over the top, if you do one that's right over the top, you get this really nice refracted and reflected light here. And if you move to different angles, you can see that that lighting over the top just really sets off this center piece right up here. So your lighting setup really is important. You should spend quite a bit of time just making sure that the lights that you have in your scene really accentuate whatever it is that's going on with your object or your ring setup and the ring design. It's going to be different for every piece that you have. You could sometimes just do 3 lights over the top, and sometimes you could probably just do, an HDRI for the background, but for this particular one, I added these lights, which gives it that look, and then for the background to make it look really nice and even in the background, I added the HDRI lighting. So that's where the power is set to a 1, so it's a little bit high. But if you don't really know what's going on with your lighting and you want just sort of something to help you out, if you go into color management and you change the view transform to false color, it will show you where the really, really bright points are and the really dark points are. And you can use that as a guide to help you out. You should aim for sort of like neutral tones throughout the whole thing. So let's hit 0 and look at through our camera. And I'll just talk a little bit briefly about some of the render settings. So if we go here to the Octane kernel, which is basically the place where you'll add your samples and everything else. You can see here I have max samples set to 5,000, max preview samples. This stuff kind of doesn't matter, but then I have the different depth rays. So if we change these all to 1, you can see that it doesn't do anything. And when you start to pop these up more and more, you start to get more clarity in your render. And the higher these are, the longer it's going to take to render. So I'm just going to set these all to 16 because that's what I set before. But some of these should probably be 32, but I thought that the render looked just fine. And you can see here that there's a GI clamp. So the GI clamp, I just set this to the default so you guys can see what it looks like with the full amount of the fireflies and everything. You can set this to a 10, which is usually what Blender sets it at, is a 10 for the global illumination clamp to take out your fireflies. Or you can set this to a 1 if you really want to reduce everything down, but it will take the brights out of your image. So you got to be careful with how you handle that. So let's just reset this back to the default value and leave it as is. From there, if we scroll down, you can see that there's an adaptive sampling section. I have that checked on, and I have this set to a 0.03. You can set this to whatever you want. Do some test samples of very specific sections to give you a good idea, especially if you're doing an animation or something. You can see here that minimum adaptive samples is set at 128. You could set this to a 16 if you have nothing in the background, like if it's just transparent, or if it's a solid color, you can set this to like a 16 or something, and it'd be a lot quicker because it wouldn't be rendering more of those samples in the background. But that's really up to you. I also have this little group pixels thing selected here. So it says here size of the pixel groups that are evaluated together to decide whether sampling should stop or not. You can set these to higher values so it kind of like checks the areas around it to do some other adaptive sampling. So let's go ahead and close that down. And let's just do a really quick render of this particular image, and I'll show you what the compositing does. What I'm going to do is I'm going to let this just render out the image, and then we'll take a look at what it looks like. And make sure that you set this to a solid view, because if you keep this at a rendered view, it will give you a little bit of an error because I'm using the free one, and it will say that there's like two renders going on, but really it's just a viewport and the regular rendering. So let's go ahead and render this out, and we'll wait and then take a look at what the compositor is doing. So you can see that it just finished. It's at 17 minutes and 55 seconds. Obviously, that is a little bit of time, especially if you are the kind of person who doesn't have an RTX 3090 like I have. This might take a little while for you. So if you want, you can change in the output properties here. You can change this where it's right now set to 2 times 1080 by 1080. So you can change this value here to 150 or 100% to save time. But let's go ahead and look at this. So it already composited, and if we go to the compositing tab here, let's just minimize some of these things here. You can see that we have some nodes. Here's the render layers. So you have the image. So you'll see in the backdrop here, if you look right there, there should be a lot of noise. Let's actually zoom this. You can see there's quite a bit of noise. And with the add-on Node Wrangler, if I Control Shift left click this, there's the alpha, and then we have the beauty pass here. So with the beauty pass, you can see that it's all denoised and everything, but it's a little bit muddy. It's kind of not the best, and that's what it tends to be with denoising and dispersion effects like this. It does tend to look like this. So the way that I get around this is if you take the original image here. So you could always do like a lot more samples, but if you don't want to do more samples, you could take the original image and throw it through this despeckle, and you can use this to like sort of change some of these settings here. But this basically just gets rid of. You can see there's some of the really bright highlight sections get kind of pulled out from there. Then I have this mix node here that uses this despeckle and the beauty pass, and it sort of puts them together. So it sort of like turns down the amount of the speckling effect from the original, but it also adds some of that denoising so it looks a little bit more smooth. So it's sort of like, mixing between the two, and you can take this factor and move it around. So that's full noisy. All the way to the right, you can see that it's fully denoised, and then I think this was set to a 0.65, which I thought was a nice happy medium. Then we have a glare node here, and you can use a simple star or you can use the streaks as well, like I did in one of the sample images, but that will add some of the glow effects. You can see I set the mix to a negative 0.75, which basically just pulls out some of the value being added. So if I change this to a 0, that would be that the glow effects are fully added over the top, and it's a little bit too strong. So if you put a negative point, let's see, I think it was a 6.5 or a 7.5 or something like that in there. If you put that in there, it'll tone down how much is being added there. Then I have a color balance node, which if I just take the mix here and I put it in here just to save some time on the rendering, if we take a look, you can see that it's basically coloring the image. So I have brought the gamma way down, brought the lift up, and brought the gain up a little bit, and then did a little bit of color adjustments here to just neutralize the coloring to get it kind of where I want it to be. So again, here's the original. It's fine. It's just a little bit plain for me. This just gives it a little bit more of a luster to it. It just looks a little bit nicer in my opinion. And then we have a hue saturation value node, which basically I just pulled out some of the saturation If we go between the two, you can see I just pulled some of that saturation out. You can see it really a lot right in the dispersion effects there. See, I pulled it up just a bit, and then I sent that into the compositor. So this says use alpha and stuff like that. We really don't need to worry about an alpha for this because it's just one image, and I'm just throwing this into something to show you guys and exporting it as a sort of just like a regular image node or a image file. I'm not doing a whole lot of stuff with this. So that's pretty much how the compositor is set up. And this works pretty well with any view angle from this one. Or if you have your lighting set up really nicely and you have a nice background and everything else, you should be able to use this same setup to get your image looking somewhat like this. And that's pretty much how to do this in a nutshell. I know this is not as articulate and as detailed as a lot of my other tutorials, but I'm really hoping that those of you who are using Octane have some experience with these items, with all the terms that I'm using, and understand the general basics of how to do this stuff, and that this was just kind of like a sort of like a guide or some pointers to help you get some really nice looking jewelry when you're inside of Octane Render, because I know some people have been asking about this. So if you want to know how I did it, you can watch this video as many times as you want, or you can download the file. Again, the file is in the video description. You can get the link there, and I will see you all next time on DJ Tutorials.